This is Saudi Arabia, one of the richest nations on earth with a GDP of over $1 trillion or around $2.2 trillion when adjusted for purchasing power parity. Buoyed by their oil and gas riches and massive infrastructure projects, they've become one of the biggest hubs for tourism and construction in the world and look to expand even further. But directly bordering them down south is Yemen, a nation with almost half the population living below the poverty line and ranked 183rd on the Human Development Index. And just over 800 miles northeast of Saudi Arabia is Syria, a nation more known for its numerous conflicts than any economic breakthroughs. It even fares worse than Yemen when it comes to the sheer amount of its citizens living below the poverty line, with over 3/4 of their population reported to fall under. All three nations have significant deposits of crude oil and have a significant percentage of their population below the age of 35. None of them are landlocked either, meaning they face significantly less barriers to trade. But while Saudi Arabia continues to grow and diversify its economy, Syria and Yemen are struggling to even maintain a viable one. And this trend seems to have been repeated across numerous majority Muslim nations across the world, with some nations experiencing massive or at least stable growth and others facing economic decline and staring down the barrel of extreme poverty. So this begs the question, why are the economies of some Muslim nations dying while others are thriving? And the answer to that lies in a bunch of factors which we're about to go into. But before we get into it, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about the global economy. Islamic countries are polarizing in terms of the current trajectory of their economies, but it's important to note that they aren't the only countries practicing similar religions and facing different economic outcomes. You can find a lot of examples of this, especially in Christian-dominated African nations. In East Africa, for example, Kenya, which has a majority Christian population, has an economy almost 40 times the size of Burundi, another country with a majority Christian population, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. However, it's important to note that most of these African countries aren't driven by Christian ideologies, as most Africans tend to put tribal affiliations above religion and even nationality in some cases. But this isn't the case for Muslims in Africa, who tend to put the practices of Islam above even tribal affiliations in some conditions. This is especially the case for fundamentalist Muslim demographics across the continent. In Africa, the countries with a Muslim majority have an average of around 40% of their population living below the poverty line, compared to the 34% average across the continent. Although there are some outliers such as Morocco and Egypt, whose economies are well on their way to becoming developed. Comparatively, the Christian-dominated nations have put emphasis on more progressive practices and actively seek to connect to the global economy through trade, travel, and education. And a very interesting example of the variances in lifestyle between the Muslims and Christians in Africa comes from the most populous black nation on earth, Nigeria. Nigeria is a very special case due to its scale of religious and tribal diversity, as it's home to over 200 million people. Its Christian and Muslim population is shared at a ratio of almost 1-to-1, with the northern part being almost 70% Muslim and the southern part being almost 70% Christian. The Muslim-dominated north is made up mostly of low-skilled laborers due to their comparatively lower literacy rates. They also have very high birth and child mortality rates and also make up the majority of the Nigerian army due to their rather combative nature. The Christian-dominated South, on the other hand, have higher literacy rates, which allows them to work skilled jobs and contribute more value to the economy. Hence, they're generally more prosperous than their northern counterparts. They are less willing to take risks with their lives, however. This can be seen by their lower child mortality rates as well as low levels of recruitment into the Nigerian army. Both northern and southern Nigeria are religious, with an overwhelming majority of the country going to their place of worship at least once a week, and about 95% reporting that they pray every day. But the northern Muslims seem more radical in their reactions to those who break Islamic laws, with Sharia law being practiced in 12 out of the 36 states in the country. This single country has two parts with very polarizing lifestyles, and on occasions, this breeds some political resentment and often results in conflict between both sides, the more liberal South and the conservative North. Despite this, the country has had a Muslim president for a majority of its 63 years of independence, as there's usually some form of solidarity between northern Muslims when it comes to voting the most popular Muslim candidate. Islamic clerics and scholars in the country are known to influence the broader voting patterns of Muslims in favor of Islamic teachings rather than selecting the most suitable candidate. This is in stark contrast to the Christians, who are usually divided between voting across tribal lines based on hope or not voting at all. The northern part of Nigeria, just like many other Islamic nations, has faced and continues to face a lot of barriers to its growth, such as religious killings, insurgency, and terrorism. And with a lack of finances and education to climb up the social ladder, a lot of young, disillusioned people within the region are left having to join these radical groups just to survive, and the vicious cycle is made to continue. Looking at these trends, it's become obvious that conflict has had a major role to play in the declining economies of some Muslim nations. These conflicts are often propagated by radical Islamists trying to push an agenda and further dividing the people of the country along religious lines. But this hasn't always been the case in Islamic nations. Back in the medieval ages before the 12th century, while most European nations were deep into what is known as the Dark Ages, Islamic nations such as the Persians and the Ottoman Empire were advancing their societies during what is referred to as the Islamic Golden Age. In fact, many inventions still in use today, such as algebra and the Arabic numbering system, were created by Islamic societies. So many advances in the fields of biology, architecture, agriculture, and medicine were made in the Arab world during this period of economic boom. Trade, industry, and commerce were also at a high level, with the Arab world accounting for around 10% of the world's GDP at the time. So in comparison to the rest of the world, the Arab society was majorly wealthy. But something happened from the 13th century onwards. While European nations were entering into an almost Arabic-influenced Renaissance era, the Arabic world itself was seeing a decline across multiple tenets of its society. There are many theories as to why this happened, but a common theory was that Islamic religion shaped the political institutions of the medieval Islamic world, and over time its citizens, especially political leaders, then began to seek favors and advice from religious scholars rather than scientists and free thinkers. For example, the Ottoman Empire rejected the printing press and banned it for almost 2 centuries because their religious leaders wanted a monopoly on the transmission of religious knowledge, which couldn't be possible with printed text being readily available. This is unlike Christianity, which permeated into already established civilizations with their own systems of government and political practices based on non-Christian concepts. That is not to say that Christianity never influenced the political landscape of the regions which it permeated into. It's no surprise that the European Dark Ages happened at a time when the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church wielded so much diplomatic and economic power over the political landscape in Europe. This stifled creativity and hence technological advancements, as people were often ostracized or even murdered for discovering anything that wasn't in line with the teachings of the religious texts. Most education during this period took place in monasteries, cathedrals, and convents, and were often very close-minded. This, added to the fact that books were rare, caused a decline in innovation, which remained that way for the most part, until the Renaissance era kicked off around the 14th century, and especially with the invention of the printing press, which allowed for better dissemination of information. As European nations adopted progressive labor laws that enhanced productivity, such as including women into the labor force, Arabic nations opted instead to follow Islamic law, which prohibited this. The European nations also created a solid banking system which allowed individuals to take loans to build industries, while the Arab world couldn't adopt such practices at the time due to Islamic law. And over time, the Arab world, which used to be home to commerce and industry, evolved into a society focused on religious bureaucracy and military operations. Islamic religion then quickly became a way to empower political leaders who used religious scholars to gain legitimacy amongst the citizens of the state, and this is a practice that has remained to this day. The Islamic world today is quite different to what it was back in the Middle Ages. In fact, between the 1920s and the 1980s, much of the Islamic world, especially the Arab world, experienced a period of economic growth. But incidents such as the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the rise of various jihadist and militia groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hamas across the Islamic world, and Boko Haram in West Africa, have led to a sharp decline in their fortunes, as millions have been displaced from their homes in the ensuing conflicts. These organizations usually sought to create a totalitarian Islamic state where the laws would be in accordance to their interpretations of the holy laws. In general, the Islamic nations which have been able to avoid meddling into political affairs by Islamic organizations have fared better than those who haven't been able to. So the economic growth of these countries can be attributed to the relative stability they experience. Population also has a role to play, as Islamic countries such as Qatar, UAE, and Kuwait all have low populations being supported by their oil wealth. And although outliers like Indonesia aren't totally poor, when compared to the global average, they aren't exactly rich either. The Islamic world has never faced as much disparity in terms of economic propositions as it does today, and those at the bottom of the ladder face an uphill task to ever break out of the cycle. At the end of the day, it's not really a religion-influenced thing for some Islamic nations to be poorer than the others, as it looks like political stability is more important to economic development than the propagation of religion. So for these poorer Islamic nations to break out of the vicious cycle, they may have to adopt some brave measures which may not sit well with their religious organizations. Peace and religious tolerance should be the order of the day in their various nations rather than the expansion of Islam. And accepting some of the progressive ways of non-Muslims, such as Western education, might be the first step to achieving this. What are your thoughts on the fortunes of economies of Islamic countries? Do you think they would ever change their ways and adopt progressive policies to put their economies back on track, or will they be forever doomed by sticking to their guns? Please let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next video.